It's less than 3 weeks to go until the federal budget. I know everybody is excited, but this is going to be a critical one. It could well be, and most likely will be, the last budget before the government goes to an election, which is due by May next year. The Prime Minister has already made it clear what will be the centrepiece of this budget. Indeed, it will be his big, bold plan, his second-term agenda. It's being called A Future Made in Australia. Now, sounds great. Everyone loves the idea of more stuff being made in Australia, particularly Labor Prime Ministers. The question is, at what cost to taxpayers and to consumers? Now, we still don't know all of the details of this plan for a future made in Australia, but we do know it will involve government subsidies and tax incentives aimed at trying to encourage more manufacturing of things like solar panels, batteries, other tech, green tech that's going to be needed in the transition to a net zero future. Now, the argument is we need to do this for a couple of reasons. We're too reliant on others for a lot of our goods, most notably China, even if the government won't say that bit out loud. But the other big selling point is the rest of the world is doing this, most notably the United States, with its huge Inflation Reduction Act, which is involving more than $1 trillion in spending over the decade to encourage and to attract more manufacturing investment, particularly in green manufacturing in the United States. But not everyone is convinced this is such a good idea. Various former productivity commissioners have warned about a return to the bad old days of protectionism, throwing money around on uncompetitive industries, and even the current Productivity Commissioner, Danielle Wood, appointed to the role by the Treasurer late last year, has raised some concerns. And I'm pleased to say that Danielle Wood is my guest today. Danielle Wood, very good to talk to you. I know we've spoken in many guises over the years, but in your new role, it's great to have a chat to you as the Productivity Commission Chair. First up, before we get to A Future Made in Australia, how are you finding the job a few months in?
Very much enjoying it, and thanks for having me, David. Look, it's the Productivity Commission is a hugely important institution, but I think a pretty unique institution as well. We are the government's think tank, so we advise the government on the big sort of economic, social, environmental policy questions that they're grappling with, but we're also independent of government. So we put all our advice out there on the public record. We say what we think the answer is in the national interest. That may or may not align with the government's of the day's policy position, and I think it's actually a really positive reflection on successive generations of government that they've allowed an organisation like the PC to thrive in the policy ecosystem and to continue providing advice that is really about driving long-term policy change. So, it's a huge honour to lead such an important institution, and I've had a wonderful time, meeting the fantastic, really smart, really motivated staff that are all about trying to get better public policy. And
you've already demonstrated that independence you mentioned there, that willingness to speak up, even if it creates a bit of awkwardness for the government. So let's go to that. This idea of a future made in Australia, as I say, we don't yet know all of the details. We do know it will build on existing programs like the National Reconstruction Fund, a Hydrogen Head Start, Solar Sunshot, some of these programs that are already out there involving government investment to get things off the ground. You've raised some concerns. From what you know of this plan so far, how do you feel about it?
As you say, we don't know all of the details. We have this kind of packaging up of existing supports. There's certainly been a foreshadowing. I think it's fair to say in speeches from the Prime Minister and others of subsidies, additional subsidies for green manufacturing to be announced in the budget. Look, I have raised concerns about it largely on the grounds that I think we need to be very cautious into stepping into this space. You are right that we have seen this proliferation of international subsidies. One view of the world is when other countries subsidise their production, we say thank you very much. That means lower prices for Australian consumers. Where that relates to green products, that's actually going to help us with our own green transition and getting to zero emissions quickly and more cheaply.
I mean, that's a reasonable argument, isn't it? If the US is willing to spend all this money, we can just take advantage of it and buy the cheap stuff they're going to subsidise.
That's exactly right. And, the counter arguments, you put a little bit in your introduction. People will say it's sort of an infant industry argument that there may be some of these areas where we will have a long-term competitive advantage. They need support to get off the ground. to build the scale and to level the playing field with some of these international subsidies. That's one argument you will hear advanced. The other is the supply chain argument, and that we need to diversify our supply chains. We don't want to have all our eggs in one basket, the China basket, as you alluded to. But that's not necessarily, we need to be really careful here. That's not necessarily an argument for producing here. It can be an argument just for making sure that we're sourcing more broadly from friends and allies. So the concern really, David, to go to the heart of it is there may be these policy rationales, but we need to be super clear that this comes with costs. One, it's a cost to taxpayers, and you and I have spent enough time in budget lockups to know that, that those dollars have many other worthwhile uses, whether that's reducing taxes or spending elsewhere. Second, we know from our experience in industry assistance in the 70s and early 80s, once you create a class of businesses that are reliant on government subsidies, they become very good at coming back and putting the case for more. So what starts as kind of an infant industry argument, your infants grow up, they turn into very hungry teenagers, and it's kind of hard to turn off the tap. And thirdly, you're diverting resources from elsewhere in the economy. So, if we're pushing jobs and capital into certain sectors, by definition, we're moving that from other parts of the economy. And in a world where we've got really tight labour markets, we know we're going to need more jobs in the future in care economy, in data and digital, in even parts of the green transition like building out the electricity grid are going to require whole lots of labour. We're setting up industries that are going to be competing for labour in those areas that we need. So if we're going to do it, we need to be super clear about what we're trying to achieve. We need to have off-ramps, particularly if we're making infant industry arguments. And I would argue we need some kind of process for independent assessment. Otherwise we risk, sort of a giant pork barrelling scheme or lobbying dictating where these big pots of government money are going to go.
Now, look, you've raised a number of potential risks there, and I'm keen to go through them. But from what you know so far, are you satisfied, or are you waiting to see the detail on all of this?
Look, I have to wait and see the detail. I mean, there's certainly been some announcements. The solar panel subsidies is an example of one that certainly raised my concern. It didn't.
Yeah, what's
seem
your concern
to me
about that? Because I guess to put it simply, what's wrong with buying cheap solar panels from China or anywhere else?
There's nothing wrong with it. I mean, that's what trade looks like. And as I said in the intro, lots of benefits to consumers from us, and will help speed up the green transition. So do we need to make
them here, I guess is the question. Do we need to subsidise making them here?
Look, the only argument you would have, I think, for doing so is if we thought that we had this very strong long-term competitive advantage in the manufacture of solar panels. And I have not seen that case made. This is a highly commoditised product. It's very dependent on the scale of production. We've seen existing manufacturers around the world struggling to compete. Look, if an Australian solar panel manufacturer is internationally competitive, that's fantastic. Go out there and do that. But the question is, should we be using government money to support that? And it's not clear to me in that particular case that the case has been made. And that's the same sort of threshold I'll be bringing when I'm thinking about the measures in the budget.
Yeah, and the other big one's batteries, right? Presumably that would be on a whole other scale if we're going to support a local battery-making industry in Australia.
Yeah, look, that's right. And, there are arguments in the kind of early stage manufacture that we have some of the critical minerals here, and maybe that is something that we would be long-term competitive in. I think it's a different question when you're talking to the end-to-end manufacturing. There is, sort of modelling and numbers kicking around from industry out there, David, but, we are really calling on greater transparency. If we're going to put money into this, government money into it, we need to know why it is that there's a long-term benefit for Australians from doing that, as opposed to, industry can do that themselves. And I think we should be really clear on the assumptions that are being made that underpin that decision.
You talk about the history of supporting industries, and then it becomes very hard to unwind that support, politically difficult, I guess, particularly. Is the car industry the best example of that?
Look, it's certainly the industry that received probably the most support over the longest period of time. And, it became very adept at threatening to leave our shores if we didn't put more money in. So it meant that we spent billions of dollars of taxpayers' money in supporting that sector over time. So, I think we should heed the risks from the past when we're thinking about what we're stepping into.
And just to pick up on another point you made there about, drawing jobs and investment away from other parts of the economy, manufacturing, we actually don't make that much stuff in Australia. As a percentage of GDP, our manufacturing output is pretty low compared to some other countries. I think it's about 5% of GDP is manufacturing output, compared to 25% in countries like Germany and South Korea, 10% in the United States. The economist Saul Eslake has, I think, made the point that manufacturing is a pretty low productivity area of the economy. You were talking about a lot of service areas. Are there risks how important is manufacturing? Should we be trying to do more manufacturing, or is it a less productive part of the economy?
We don't do I don't think we should try and do manufacturing for the sake of manufacturing. And I think there is a bit of a danger to fetishize or put a lot of policy emphasis on the idea that you have to make something. Services are very valid things to produce. We trade services. We obviously have a highly productive mining industry as well. Ultimately, trade is about the principle of comparative advantage. And we all gain in a world where we specialise in the things that we're good at, other countries specialise in the things that they're good at, and then we go ahead and trade. And that, liberalised trade agenda that we've seen over recent decades has made Australians very well off. It's made the world very well off. So in stepping away from that and trying to kind of push resources into certain sectors, it's not something that you should do lightly.
But, the government would argue the game has changed. You look at what's happening in the US, in Europe, elsewhere, with these huge programs. The geopolitics is shifting. We got to keep up, otherwise we won't have an economy in a net zero future that can compete. To what degree is that argument right, do you think?
Well, again, you're bundling in a whole lot of different policy objectives there. So we really need to be careful about what we're talking about. So if the argument is the US is pouring, or other countries are putting large amounts of subsidies into their products, and we are particularly concerned that that is distorting trade away from areas where we think we do have a long-term competitive advantage, then we need to be really specific about that and be clear on what grounds we think we have that advantage. We have to recognise we're not going to be able to compete on subsidies alone. The scale of the money going in the US and in Europe and China is just something that we can't match. And I think the Business Council and others have been making the point quite rightly. If that's the case, maybe we are better thinking about the other elements of competition that make it attractive to locate in Australia. Thinking about the kind of approvals processes and permitting and the skills system and other things that are going to be helpful to Australian businesses to survive if they genuinely can compete on an international scale.
Sounds like, just before we leave this whole area, it sounds like you're unconvinced. I know the details are yet to come, but it sounds like you've got some real worries about this whole agenda.
Look, I certainly have concerns, and that was why I went on the record and voiced them. We are yet to see the detail. I know the government is doing work and has acknowledged the need for some of these safeguards that I'm talking about. So,
are they taking your input? Have you spoken to the Treasurer? Are they listening to what you're saying?
Look, I've certainly had the opportunity to provide input into government around this, and I know that those concerns have been heard and recognised. Right.
So you have actually had a chat with them about this idea. Did they tell you what the plans are?
Look, I can't go into those conversations for reasons you understand, David.
All right. Well, look, beyond this, what would be on your wish list? We've often done this in your previous roles before a budget or on budget night. What should be the priorities in terms of boosting productivity right now?
Look, I'm not going to give a sort of specific list of priorities for the budget, but what we have said is that productivity agenda has to be a broad agenda. We often talk about it like there's sort of a single lever you can pull and you've solved the productivity challenge. That is simply not how it operates. Productivity reform is a game of inches. So you make gains by improving the enablers in terms of education and infrastructure and all the systems that enable us to produce things, and by removing impediments for businesses to invest and thrive. So, across that, we think about migration system being really important, and there's some key reforms going on there. We think about education and skills and training being critical, and making sure that we are, building people with the capacity to work in the jobs of the future. I think there's a really important agenda going on around digital and tech, and particularly AI, and how we regulate AI and we don't stifle the opportunities that are going to be there for the economy in that space. And there's some really important changes going on in competition policy as well. So the government's announced some changes to mergers laws. They're looking at non-competes. And really excitingly, a revival of national competition policy, where the states and Commonwealth get together and try and look at ways to introduce reforms that pro-competition, make the business environment easier and deliver better consumer outcomes. So
just to pick up on some of those,
really
these inches as you put them, they all matter. You mentioned non-competes there. Let's just talk about that, because the US overnight has effectively banned them. I mean, this will play out through the courts, but said employers have got to stop issuing these non-compete clauses that prevent a worker going to work for a rival employer. As you say, the government's looking at it here. Apparently hairdressers, yoga instructors, all sorts of workers are being subjected to these non-compete clauses. Do they need to go altogether?
Look, the breadth of these clauses is pretty extraordinary, as you point to, and I think it's a great pieces of work that the Competition Task Force has done looking at it. What these things do is make it harder for people to move around the economy. That's obviously bad for those workers.
And that hurts productivity too, right?
It hurts productivity, that's right. So we know that one of the key ways we get productivity gains is people moving from low productivity jobs to higher productivity jobs. So we don't want to see impediments to that in the economy. Banning them altogether is obviously a very strong step, and it's really fascinated to see the US move this morning. There may be some valid cases for businesses in having these in place, and the Competition Task Force is going through this process at the moment of consulting broadly on this. I expect the government will move, and I think certainly it's very hard to justify the status quo,
You'd like
whether
to see
they'll
them really
land on a
limited,
full
basically.
ban. That's right. Yeah. I think there's other ways you might restrict them rather than going a full ban, but okay. I'd like to wait to see where that work goes.
Now, national competition payments, federal and state governments are, they've agreed to progress this, but what would you like to see here? And give us, a practical example of how competition payments from the feds to the states might actually work.
And we have a history of them working. I think it's really important to note, we did this in a big way through the 1990s. We saw, large amounts of kind of impediments to competition torn down, and we got a big economic dividend from that, that we estimated is worth about $5,000 per Australian. So this is potentially significant. There are, like productivity, there's going to be a range of things on this list. One example, I think, where there's still a lot of progress to be made is in terms of labour mobility across states and into Australia. So this is around skills recognition. If you're, a recognised electrician in New South Wales, can you then go and move to Queensland and do that job? But also, as we're bringing in more...
Is that still a problem? Like an electrician or a plumber can't get their qualification recognised interstate?
Yeah, so we have moved on some, but there's still a lot of way to go across the board on skills recognition, and even further to go when it comes to recognition of skills of migrants. So we run a very big skilled migration program. We bring people in with certain skills, and then we often make them jump through a lot of hoops to demonstrate those qualifications here. So, that's one area where there's big scope for gains. Other areas I think include fees and charges levied by state governments. I think there's a big piece around data availability and IP, which is relevant to AI and how we get the benefits from that. So there's going to be a number of different areas, I think, where national competition policy can push into. But it's that sort of idea of getting everyone around the table and agreeing and providing the incentives that is what makes it different.
What about on tax? I mean, we know the rejig stage 3 tax cuts will be in the budget. There won't be much more on tax, but what can be done and what should be done on tax to try and boost productivity and also tackle this growing problem of intergenerational inequity?
Look, tax is not an area that the Productivity Commission has looked at of late. We stand very ready if the government would like to send us a reference on tax, but there is no question and there is no denying that there are productivity improvements possible if we were to shift the balance of taxes across our economy. So, at the moment, there are very inconsistent ways we tax savings. Income is one example, and the fact that you pay a lot different if you get income from a bank account versus put money into a house or superannuation, and some of that does pick up that intergenerational theme that you're talking about, David. It's kind of unclear why different age groups face very different effective tax rates. Well, I mean,
in your previous roles, you've talked about, we need a debate on taxing large inheritances as well. Is that something you still support, or do you have to be a bit more careful about some of those views now?
Well, look, as I said, it's not something the Commission has done, work on in recent times. I'm not going to sit here and advocate for particular pieces of tax reform, but what I will say is the tax system makes a lot of difference to incentives and ultimately productivity. So it's certainly an area where we think the government could spend some time and focus in its second term. That said, it's really hard to move on tax, and I've reflected on this in my previous role as well. We seem almost incapable of having a sensible tax debate in this country. It does get very hysterical very quickly. So I do have sympathy for governments of why they're a little wary to go to some of these spaces.
And look, a final one that's a never-ending hot political debate as well, and that's energy. And again, I don't know if the Productivity Commission has looked specifically at which way we need to go here, but we're on this journey to net zero. We now have this debate over whether the government's preferred approach of renewables with batteries and pumped hydro and gas and so on, or the coalition's nuclear alternative is the best way to go. Do you venture a position or a view on any of that?
Look, again, I'll have to be careful because, we haven't done specific work on this. I mean, from a first principles approach, we would always support a kind of technologically neutral view. So, we don't sort of preempt one technology or another. That said, I have seen, a fair amount of discussion and evidence base produced by others suggesting, nuclear would take a very long time and could be an expensive option. But, in all of these debates, we would encourage whoever's advocating a particular outcome to be really clear on why it is and what the supporting evidence is to support that particular view of the world.
So perhaps coming back to where we started on the manufacturing side of things, when it comes to nuclear, you need to see the detail. We need some more transparency before you're convinced this is worth exploring.
Look, that's right. So, you'd want to be convinced that it is cost competitive with the alternatives and that it can be done in the kind of timeframes that we need. And, one thing that we've observed a lot, I think, over on major government projects over the past decades is, cost overruns seem to have become the norm. And my old colleagues at the Grattan Institute showed, the bigger the project, the greater the likelihood of a big cost overrun. So, being realistic about what the kind of cost is of anything that's put forward, I think is really important.
Well, Danielle Wood, we do appreciate your independence and willingness to enter the debate. Really good to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, David.
And we are keen for your thoughts on this conversation and suggestions for the podcast as well. Please rate, review, subscribe wherever you're listening to this. And if you've got an idea for a topic you'd like us to get into, send us an email, insiders@abc.net.au. Thanks to those of you who've already done so. We will be back in your feed next week, and I'll see you Sunday morning for Insiders. Bye for now.
Making us all feel very excited about being here.